Welcome. My name is Mr. Schwenk, and this is Cleo's Corner. I know we've already had two episodes that have talked about Europeans coming to America, but there's an idea in the minds of many that history in America begins with a white dude who thought he was in Asia, landing on an island barely in North America. However, that mentality reflects what historians often call ethnocentrism, or the belief that your perspective is somehow superior to or more correct than the perspectives of other cultures. The reality is that when Europeans came to North America, they did not discover an empty landscape, but rather a landmass with maybe as many as 50 million people in it. Our big idea in this episode is about how Native American groups lived before European arrival and how their lives changed as a result. Now, it's important to realize right off the bat that this is a very short overview of this topic. There were hundreds of unique cultures in the Americas that would join and split from each other periodically over about 6,000 years. There were significant groups like the Anasazi and the Mississippians that rose, declined, and disappeared even before the Europeans arrived. Their descendants lived on as other tribes that would eventually come into contact with Europeans and Americans. So there's way too much information about Native Americans over way too much time to discuss in only one episode. What that means is that I will need to start to resort to generalizing some information. Generalization is a bad habit that historians have when we need to get a lot of information to people and not enough time to do it in. This has some negative effects, such as stereotyping. So we always must be careful when we use generalizations. I want to be very clear that there were and still are many diverse Native groups with their own cultures and traditions. It's a shame that there's not enough time to do justice to all of them because it is a fascinating topic. But that being said, the first Americans arrived, according to our best theories, via a land bridge between Asia and North America during the last ice age when the Earth's oceans were lower. Today, we call this the Bering Land Bridge. There are some historians and scientists that argue other means of transport, like boats crossing the Pacific or even early voyages from Europe across Iceland and Greenland, but those are not really seriously considered, and modern DNA has sort of eliminated those possibilities. The evidence available points to increasingly older artifacts being found coming from the direction of Alaska and the Bering Sea area. These first Americans traveled south and fanned out eastward along North and South America. Historians and archaeologists have found evidence that Native Americans were producing agriculture as early as 7,000 years ago, which puts them in the same range as the rest of the Neolithic Revolution in Asia and Africa. Over time, natives adapted and specialized their lives to the environments that they were living in. Eastern woodland tribes like the Iroquois, the Mohawk, the Huron, Potawatomi, Powhatan, Shawnee, all these groups would clear forests and plant maize, or what we call corn, as well as other crops like squash and beans, pumpkins, cotton, and potatoes, and they hunted a lot of small game as well. They used the trees that they cleared to build timber frame longhouses and wigwams and really adapted their land to fit their needs. The Great Plains Indians, by contrast, were primarily hunter gatherers and adapted their entire lives to the food that they ate, to the houses that they lived in, based on their primary prey, the buffalo. Horses that were captured from Spanish conquistadors or had run away from them multiplied in the American environment, and they completely changed the Great Plains civilizations like the Sioux, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, Apache, Crow, groups like that. Most of the Great Plains Indians survived longer than their eastern woodland counterparts because they did not meet white Europeans in large numbers until the US began to expand westward in the 1800s. We'll discuss them in later episodes. The American Southeast also had five extraordinary tribes that were called by the Americans the five civilized tribes, including the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. They will have a big part of our story later as well. Southward in Mexico, the Olmec, Mayan, and Aztec civilizations dominated Central America. They had sophisticated mathematics. They looked at the stars and developed calendars. They built temples and had complex religious practices. In both cultures, human sacrifice was common. In the case of the Aztec, a daily human sacrifice was conducted to ensure that the sun would rise. I'm in constant wonder that in all the long years of this practice going on, no one ever considered, like, I don't know, postponing the sacrifice a half hour just to make sure that the sun really needed a human heart to rise. I kind of feel like you could disprove that pretty quick. At any rate, in the mountains of South America, the Incan civilization was possibly the largest civilization in the world at the time of European contact. And between the resources they had and the environment that they were living in, they created large cities of stone in remote mountains and established a complex system of well developed roads. Many of these sites were destroyed when the conquistador Pizarro conquered the Incan Empire. But in 1911, archaeologists discovered an amazing remote city that had been abandoned before the conquest and wound up surviving the destruction. It's the best example of Incan architecture and city design ever. Machu Picchu is the name of it, and it became a time capsule of Incan technology, including their engineering of stone without mortar. This was just dry stacked stone, but it still fits together so tightly that you cannot get a sheet of paper between the stones. In fact, the worse the environment was for living, the more technologically innovative the natives were who lived there. For example, to feed themselves, the Inca would carve their fields straight out of the mountains themselves, using terracing to have enough land to grow their food. In the harsh climate of the American Southwest, the descendants of the Anasazi created cliff dwellings to protect themselves from the sun and the heat of the day. And they also developed ways of gathering water and preserving food in big cisterns in valleys. Natives certainly had their own sophisticated technologies, but they did not have the technologies that Europeans recognized, like the wheel and animal domestication and metalworking and written language. And yes, before you go fact checking me, the Incans did not domesticate the llama, and the Mayans had hieroglyphics. But again, we're talking about, generalization, right? So native groups were typically organized into tribes. Now, sometimes these tribes might rise to a level of sophistication and organization that they could become empires in their own right, like the Aztec, the Olmec, and the Incan civilizations. Other times, tribes may unite loosely for common defense or resources, like the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast. Now, these groups still could become immensely powerful and have impressive structures and organization. The Mississippians, or the mound builder culture, was centered around what is today St. Louis, Missouri, from about 800 to 1300 CE. Their territory spread over the entire Mississippi River, basically north to south, and east to the Appalachian Mountains. They also spread west as far as Oklahoma. Archaeological evidence shows that their cities would have been sizable. with these weird flat topped mounds that they built that would hold important buildings. Many of these mounds still exist today around the US. The similarity between their structures and the stepped pyramids of the Olmec and Aztec cannot be ignored. The Olmec predate the Mississippians, so we know that the Mississippians might have gotten it from them, and the Aztec probably got it from the Olmec. However, it's hard to believe that both groups would have developed similar architectural styles without having some kind of connection. However, North American native cultures never fully developed the characteristics of civilization the way that Aztecs and Incans did. The reason for this is fairly easy to understand. In order for early civilizations to start, you need water. But obviously, more importantly, you need a constrained land. Living in a group means disagreements. If you have a lush, resource rich land and you disagree with the people in your group, you just move away. With a constrained land like a desert or a jungle or living up in the mountains, you have to resolve your differences and create government. The more people are forced to live close to each other, eventually your population gets so large that you develop the other characteristics of civilization. In North America, tribes simply did not have the constrained land like the Aztec and the Olmec. So the best North America had were loose confederacies like the Iroquois because you could always just move away from the tribe that you had a disagreement with. Native religion was based on local spirits and practices, but most, if not all, native groups also believed in some kind of supreme great spirit. Although natives typically had this creator god, they were not monotheistic the way Christian Europeans were. As far as social structure goes, natives were very different from Europeans in two important ways. First, property tended to be held in common by the entire village, and there was no real concept of private property. As long as you were cultivating the land, there was an expectation that it was yours and what was being grown is loosely yours, but the land itself could not be owned. The other big difference is that many tribes were matrilineal. That means that the family is traced through the women of the tribe. When a couple were married, the man would become part of his wife's tribe versus a wife becoming part of or taking a man's name. Women also held important tribal jobs in matters of religion and making tribal decisions. Certainly, tribal gender roles were far more relaxed and equitable than what Europeans were used to. Unlike Europeans who had very strict views about how women were supposed to act, native groups were far less restrictive on matters like sexuality. What this means is that when Europeans arrive in the New World, they don't quite know what to make of the natives. Depending on lots of different factors, Europeans might reach out to natives for cooperation, such as how the French worked with the natives to secure furs. Others, like the Spanish, wound up eliminating entire cultures through the conflict and sickness that they spread. On one hand, the Europeans are surprised that there is a really large number of people who have never participated in global history up to this point. Driven, as many Europeans were, by their faith, they saw this as an opportunity to spread Christianity, whether the natives wanted it or not. On the other hand, but kind of still related to the first perspective, was the idea of the noble savage. The noble savage idea was a tendency for Europeans to romanticize natives as simple or less evolved than other Europeans, and ultimately that they needed rescuing from their savagery. In some ways, natives were seen as an ideal version of humanity, as it should exist in nature, and without any of the negative characteristics that Europeans had. They were simple and savage because they had never been exposed to the truth of Christianity. This then became the justification for all of their efforts to Christianize the natives and shape them into good little Europeans. What is absolutely certain is that native cultures begin to decline or are wiped out almost immediately after coming into contact with Europeans. Not all natives were contacted at the same time, though, as I mentioned before. It's a long process. It starts in 1492 with Columbus and it continues until the late 1800s as the United States completes its expansion to the Pacific Ocean. Natives were also conveniently seen by Europeans as less than human and therefore made a perfect source of labor on European plantations in the New World. The Spanish developed what was something called the encomienda system to reward conquistadors with massive tracts of land for colonizing the New World. This included the natives on the land to be used as labor. All the conquistador had to do was agree to try to Christianize the natives. So let's say Hernando, a hypothetical conquistador and noble just trying to improve his lot in the world, agrees, and he's assigned a plot of land and a bunch of natives to work for him. He arrives on his island. He informs these poor, unfortunate subhumans that their miserable lives are going to get so much better now that he is going to make them become Christian. And oh, by the way, you also have to be my slaves for life, but we'll talk about that later. Now, the decision is up to you. And by that, I mean it's really up to me because you are a childlike savage and incapable of having rational thoughts and making good decisions for yourself. So I think that this is going to be a great relationship. Now, you can only imagine how enthusiastic the natives were at being delivered from their awful existence of living on pristine Caribbean beaches with their families and fishing and swimming all day. So, and furthermore, of course, how happy they were at being allowed to become Christian and work all day without compensation until they died. In addition, the natives were also generously given a whole host of diseases like measles and smallpox, which they had no immunity for, which only ended up ending their slavery quicker. It all worked out for the Europeans, however, who were able to transport new exotic goods and wealth from the Americas back to Europe while opening new markets for European goods to America. Today, historians call this the Columbian Exchange. The unfortunate demise, however, of all of their workers left the Spaniards in the predicament of how to do all this work. Their solution was to just simply import labor from Africa, thus beginning the African slave trade. But that's a discussion for another day. Ultimately, we don't have any records from the natives because they didn't have any written language. What we do have are records written by Spanish friars and priests that are from native perspectives. While we do have records from these priests who are critical of how natives were treated, and that is helpful, we can't be certain that what was written down for the natives by the priests, who were also having to translate from a new language, and were part of the culture doing the harm, we can't guarantee that those are entirely accurate. So that leaves us with our last thought for today, which is the importance of always not only looking for bias and to be critical of the sources, but also to consider what voices are missing from the historical record when we look. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on Cleo's Corner.